If you joined the band, you were probably considered queer. If you were in the chorus in junior high school, I remember boys, accused of being queer or gay. And jokes would be made about you, and stories would be made up about you giving the band leader a blowjob, etc. I bought into the notion that anything homosexual or weak or effeminate was bad. Hi, this is Mike Balaban. Welcome to another episode of BAMMER Talks. Today my subject is going to be the idea and the manifestations of femininity and masculinity in the gay community, in the gay male community in particular, and how that has changed over the last 5 decades. In the 60s and 70s, when gay liberation was just beginning to be fought and some results recognized, it was largely thought publicly that homosexuals were effeminate and simpering and weak and everything that most people didn't want to be. The problem with that homophobia was that it manifested itself inside the gay community as well as in society, meaning that if you grew up and you finally reached the conclusion, unhappily, that you were probably destined to be gay, you were faced with a limited notion of how you could behave in order to be gay and to fit in. And that was that you had to be really effeminate, using the term she to describe male, friends as well, and to buy into the whole public notion that gay men were weak. I'll give you a sense for what it was like for one young gay boy, me. I was born in the early 50s. I was in my single years in the late 50s and early 60s, entered teenage status in 65, and then Stonewall happened in 1969. And my attitudes were formed during that period, growing up in a deeply conservative, very religious, homophobic, racist, segregated southern area in the panhandle of Florida next to Alabama. And there you attempted to be just like everyone else. Roles were very rigidly prescribed for boys and for girls, for men and for women. Women had essentially very little power or authority, very limited opportunities for them in the workforce as clerics, secretaries, nurses, and men were supposed to rule the earth. And in order to do that, you needed to act like a man. And that meant be masculine, if not hypermasculine. The first sign of femininity or weakness or indecision or anything that bespoke of not what a typical man would do or say left you open to the charges from your peers when we were growing up of being queer. You know, if you joined the band, you were probably considered queer. If you were in the chorus in junior high school, I remember boys accused of being queer or gay. And jokes would be made about you, and stories would be made up about you giving the band leader a blowjob, etc. Those traits were taught to me, that anything that had to do with homosexuality, and the terms we used were pansy and faggot and whatever, anything related to that was negative, was a no-no, was to be despised and put down. So even though I found myself gradually being attracted to other specific young boys, I never connected that in my mind with the idea of sex or being gay. I was just wanting to be their best friend. And I bought into the notion that anything homosexual or weak or effeminate was bad. Masculinity was to be, sought at all costs. So I quickly suppressed anything about me that might have been deemed effeminate, if it was even there to begin with. I don't know. It goes back so far that I'll never understand, if I had been left to my own devices, if I would have emerged as I am now, or if it's the result of all that early socialization. But I was so inbred against homosexuality that I couldn't even consider the thought of sex with someone I cared for deeply, who was a man, until I was in my early 20s. And what I did was I joined with the other boys in kind of laughing at jokes about gays. And so it made it very tough. I wanted to be the best little boy in the world. I wanted to be perfect. I wanted to be the man that my family and society expected me to be. So I joined the Boy Scouts. I raised cattle. I went hunting and fishing. I got into sports in a big way, everything I could play. And I did boy things. As a result, I never had a clue that I was gay, despite my burgeoning secret attraction to one or two of the boys who I was friends with. I just wrote that off as a passing phase, and everything else about me was gay, so I hid. I passed. There were obviously people who were unable to hide or pass successfully, and they got bullied, and they grew thick skins, assuming hopefully they made it out alive. In my case, the internalized homophobia that I turned in upon myself from all of the attitudes that were imposed on me by society were really destructive. So I'll give you an example. When I first moved to New York in the mid-'70s, I was 24, 25, 26. Shortly thereafter, I entered therapy to figure myself out. And sometime in the 80s, I met a handsome young guy, a little bit younger than me. I was in my early 30s. But I met him in the anteroom of my therapist. She couldn't obviously say anything actively, but she said, well, why don't you try? So I chatted him up and eventually asked him out. And we went on several dates. I don't think we ever got to have sex with each other. But I liked everything about him except a couple of things. He was in the fashion industry, which to me had, it reeked of homosexuality, and I couldn't allow that near because I was masculine and played sports and hung out with the guys. But I gradually got over the fashion aspect of things. What I couldn't get over was the fact that he, in his spare time, had a hobby, an avocation, a passion for making and baking in a kiln these extremely gorgeous and detailed dolls. And then he would dress them up in these gowns and fancy outfits. And, they were works of art, but they were still dolls. And to someone like me who'd been raised that boys don't play with dolls, I could not get over that fact about him. And in some form or other, I managed to pull away from him without ever explaining to him why, but it was because of that. Today, if I were to meet someone and they like dolls, it wouldn't bother me in the slightest, but it took me decades to overcome my own internalized homophobia. The second thing was that even though I grew up in a family with parents that acted in a local amateur theater troupe, and even though I would end up growing up to love theater, when I first moved to New York and my aunt came to town from California and invited me out to a Broadway show with her, which would have been my first, I debated it intensely and was close to saying no because theater was just so gay and I couldn't associate myself with it. Now, mind you, I had already told my close fraternity brothers and family that I was or thought I was gay, so it wasn't like it would have expanded my reach all that far, but there was something about theater that gave me the heebie-jeebies. Now, needless to say, I went with her to the theater. I enjoyed it. I gradually grew to love theater and have been to hundreds of Broadway shows. But that's just to give you another example of how deeply inbred my own internalized homophobia was and how hard I had to fight socializing with a lot of gay men and lesbians in therapy, etc., over several decades to overcome those early childhood socialization patterns. When I was growing up, that was common, dominant. You wanted nothing to do with anything queer. And mainstream portrayals of us contributed to that. It was very limited and stereotypical how we could behave. There was a lot of hyper-masculinity masculinity among the gay community to counteract the public perceptions of us, or so we thought. So that's where the leather community, the whole clone culture, bearded, macho, riding on motorcycles, it was all to take back the narrative from those who had decided that we were queenie and effeminate. Today, of course, is a much broader spectrum. Things are more fluid. Women have been raised in terms of the perceived status they occupy in society versus when I was growing up, when women's roles were very limited and their authority and power in society was pretty non-existent. So we have a very much wider range within which we can act, despite efforts by some in the government right now who represent the male white patriarchy and religious establishment to take away the rights and freedoms we've gradually developed. This internalized homophobia and misogyny is natural when you grow up in the kind of society that I did. Those attitudes were formed in the area where I grew up because of the limited room we had at that point in time in the 50s and 60s to portray ourselves in ways that were authentic. We had to be watchful that nothing about what we did if you were a gay man came across as feminine, and nothing about what you did if you were a gay woman or a lesbian would come across as butch or masculine. There was no room for effeminacy or femininity, anything that reeked of that. There was a disdain for camp and for kind of an expression of femininity. Today, there's more room for different identities and behaviors to exist: masculinity, fluidity, diversity. So I think we today also live in a time when people genuinely respect and appreciate authenticity. So even when someone might have more feminine characteristics or more fluid characteristics than someone who's traditionally masculine, there's an appreciation that they're showing themselves as who they were intended to be. I just wanted to today kind of make the point that societal attitudes have adjusted, have liberalized, have expanded. There is more room for us to be whoever we are, no matter how masculine or feminine, no matter how fluid we want to be. You know, today I've been to tea dance and seen young guys in their 20s come in wearing high heels or makeup or wigs or whatever, and there's a playfulness that goes with that and no sense of that it says anything about who they are overall. They're lucky to grow up in an era when there's that amount of freedom. Unfortunately, of course, we're dealing with Trumpism and the attempts by the conservative religious right to force women back into limited roles, to give power to white male authority, and to marginalize LGBTQ people again, which we will have to resist to our last breath. But by and large, we live in a much more open and free-thinking era than when I was raised, and people need to be grateful for that. Thank you. This has been another episode of BAMMER Talks. Mike Balaban signing off.